In the current economy, just about everyone is having a hard time with talent, finding talent, bringing it in, keeping it. And if you're a startup, there's a good chance you're having an even harder time because of the specifics around being a startup. So what I want to do in this video is break down some of the major challenges that I have seen startups have regarding talent and give you some potential solutions that may work in your situation. If you don't know who I am, my name's Matt Jertson. I'm the founder and chief learning officer of Better Everyday Studios. Before I started this company, I was the head of training and development at SpaceX for several years. I've worked with a few other startups, and now as the head of Better Everyday Studios, we work with startups of a lot of different sizes across a lot of different industries. And I've definitely seen some common challenges that they run into regarding talent. And so I want to show you some of the potential solutions that might work for you. So the first major challenge that a lot of organizations run into is having a slow hiring process. And especially for a startup, this is understandable because they often don't have a process. It's the founder is doing all the hiring, or the managers, or whoever it is, and you might not even be in a place yet where you have an HR team to manage this. And so by not having a specifically written down hiring process, you kind of don't know what comes next. How many interviews should you have? Who's responsible for following up with candidates? Who knows? And that's really going to make it hard for you to have a streamlined process where you're hiring people quickly. And if we're in the current environment, if you're trying to hire somebody and your pipeline takes 3 months and they're talking to other companies where their hiring pipeline takes 3 weeks, well, nobody's going to make it through your pipeline simply because it takes too long. No matter how great of a company you have, people aren't going to sit around unemployed waiting for you to give them the offer. And so the solution to this is really to write down your process. You need to sit down and ask yourself some questions of, how many different rounds of interviews do we have? Do we have group interviews? Who makes the final hiring decision? Who's responsible, like I said before, with following up with candidates and telling them whether you're moving forward or not? If you don't sit down and write down the answer to these questions, then you're never going to have a streamlined process. And this is certainly a situation where having a process is better than just waiting for the perfect process. You're going to be rapidly changing your organization, and who's responsible for and involved in hiring is going to be changing a lot over the next few years. And so don't worry about making the perfect process. Just make a process it and then revise it as you move forward. So then once you have that more streamlined process, faster hiring process so that you can bring people in, the next challenge that a lot of early stage companies run into is with a lot of high early turnover. And what I mean by that is, you do all this work to bring somebody in, they get started, they're really excited, and then 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in, they end up leaving and going to another company. And based on my experience, one of the key drivers to this is not having a solid onboarding program, a real onboarding program that the whole company does to give people kind of the lay of the land and help them understand, what the business does, their position in the business, what the culture is, all that kind of stuff. You need to have a standardized process for doing that and making sure people really feel welcomed. And though, I think a lot of times when I talk to companies about onboarding, especially startups will say, well, we're really small, so we handle it a little bit more informally. That's for more of a bigger company where you're hiring 10 people a week, 20 people a week. When I was at SpaceX, we sometimes hired as many as 120 people per week. That's crazy. But I would argue that, in fact, the fewer people you are hiring, the more important onboarding is. Because if you're onboarded a new person once every 3 to 6 months, then chances are you're forgetting everything that you did with the last person when it's time to hire this next person. So everybody is getting completely inconsistent information. There's no standard way of doing anything. Even if you're not for people who aren't the hiring manager, but somebody else who's involved in the process in some other way, this is very low on their priority list. They don't remember what they're supposed to do. And so having a clear onboarding process where everybody's responsibilities are clearly outlined of, who's welcoming them as soon as they accept the offer, who's saying, great, we're excited to see you soon, who's emailing them the day before onboarding and saying, see you tomorrow, all that stuff. Really important. As long as you take, if you just say, okay, I'm going to take an hour or preferably, half a day to really sit down and outline it, you can come up with a really solid process. And just like with the hiring process, the great thing is it can be revised. You don't need the perfect onboarding program. It's going to change. Your needs are going to change. But having some kind of formal onboarding process that everybody goes through is really, really critical. But then, even if you have this great onboarding process, eventually you hand them off to the people manager, to their individual manager. And this is where the third point of major friction often comes in with startups, and specifically startups, and that's low experienced managers. Because very often when a company is just starting, they need the best individual contributors, right? They need amazing people who can do amazing work. But the skills that are needed to do that work, whether you're a software company and you're building the back end of your application, or you're a manufacturing company where you're figuring out the product, the production line, chances are you need different skills than what you need to build that back end, than the kinds of skills you need to lead people. And if you don't take the time to make sure you understand what the requirements are for leading people, and it's not just that you are a great individual contributor, then you're probably going to run into problems. And so the key way that I have seen most successful, there's a couple of things that you can really do to help get around this, because there is no doubt that early on, as you're growing, the early hires expect to be promoted. They got in on the ground floor. They expect to be promoted. And so one really important thing that you can do is set up two different promotion paths. You have the promotion path that most people think about of becoming a people manager, but just as important is that you have a promotion path for individual contributors so that people can still feel like they're moving forward in their career and growing with the company. But if they don't have the skills that it takes to be a people manager, they're not put into the place of being a people manager. And so then the second thing you need to do is write down the people manager expectations. I guarantee you that if you clearly write down what you're expecting of your people managers and show that to some of the star individual contributors, many of them aren't going to want to become people managers. They're going to want to stay as an individual contributor, and that's great because that's where they want to be. That's where long-term you're going to want them. And so making sure that you have these two different things outlined for everybody, that you clearly show people what the expectations are, and then give them a different path for advancement, it's really going to help you to make sure that the managers that you have within your organization are really good, and they're not hurting your organization by getting a lot of people to leave because they themselves don't have great manager experience. Okay, so then that brings us to the final thing that is really common amongst fast-growing companies, and that is having silos between the different teams. You're growing up, you're really focused on results, everybody has a lot of work to get done, and they're so focused on getting their work done that they're not looking around and seeing what other people are doing. And so there's not a lot of communication between the different teams. There's not a lot of stuff going on where people are working together and you get people kind of working in competition and at odds with one another, often purely because they don't know what each other are doing. And so some of the things that I've seen really work with this, and in fact, if you are facing this problem, I would highly recommend you read the book Team of Teams. It does a really great breakdown of how to get disparate, high-performing teams to work well together. And some of the things that came out of that book, first off, are the importance of all hands. I know a lot of people sometimes think that all hands are just a waste of time. You're bringing everybody together, you're pausing all work. But all hands run well is a really effective way to make sure everybody basically gets on the same page with one another, so you know what's happening across the company and you never start working at odds with another team. Another thing that you can do that could be really impactful, if you have the ability to do this, is to essentially swap people between teams on somewhat of a regular basis. You take, and not the low performers, you want the high performers. You want to take the people who are highly respected around the company and sometimes have them work for other teams because they can then build the beginnings of a communication bridge between those teams so that it's more likely that all the members of the team start talking together more. And then the final thing that you want to do is clearly document the responsibilities of all the different teams within the organization so people know what other people are doing. There's a really great book called Traction that does a little bit of a spin on the traditional organizational chart, and instead of calling it an org chart, they call it a responsibility chart, where rather, pretend your company has no people in it and just make a chart of all the different, top level responsibilities, the sub responsibilities below those. Make a chart of all the major responsibilities within the company, and then map the people to those responsibilities. You don't need to do the responsibility chart, but just making sure that it's easy for everybody to find out what other people in the company do, and if they have a problem or a question, who they should go talk to, really goes a long way to help breaking down those barriers. So those are the four main kind of, talent gathering and retention problems that I have seen in a lot of organizations. These things are very common in a lot of companies. Hopefully these kinds of solutions can work out well for you. If you like this video, definitely please subscribe to the channel, and so you can not miss any more of these tips and tricks that you can use to improve talent development within your organization. I hope to see you again soon.